Welcome to Full Speed Ahead. I'm Craig Fuller here with Ellen Voie. Ellen, you are president. Are you founder of the Women in Trucking Association?
I am the founder.
So how did you get into the Women in Trucking Association? What gave you the idea?
So I was working for Schneider, and my job was manager of recruiting and retention programs. And they said, figure out how to attract and retain non-traditional groups. So when I say programs, it was like corporate level initiatives. So I'd go in and say, hey, let's have a pet policy, or let's do this, let's do that. And one of the groups they wanted me to focus on was women. And at the time, I was getting my pilot's license, and I belonged to Women in Aviation. And I thought, well, why isn't there a Women in Trucking? So I started Women in Trucking, put together a board of directors, which was all women, the very first board, and got all the legal stuff taken care of, and hired someone, because I stayed at Schneider, so I had an income for a while. And then our first year, we had 500 members.
Wow.
Yeah, that was in 2007.
2007,
yeah.
So we're talking at 13 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's grown so much and is ubiquitous. Your conference gets, how many folks come to it?
We had 1,124 registered, and it was only our 5th conference.
Wow.
So,
wow.
And that was amazing. 85% women. Think about this, Craig, at a trucking conference.
Yeah, that is, like, we do our show and we're technology focused, so we probably have a little bit more than the typical trucking conference, but usually at the large trucking conferences, where if you have women, they tend to be spouses, or daughters of the founders. You don't see a lot of women executives in this space. Why is that?
Lots of reasons, but I have to tell you, so when I first got into the trucking industry, and I would go to like an ATA event or a TCA event, there would be 3 of us, women, and in the room. There were so few who weren't spouses, put it that way. And our ranks have grown quite a bit, but not enough. So I think a couple of reasons why. I'm going to talk about women executives, and I'll talk about female drivers, but women look at the trucking industry and don't picture themselves in it. They don't picture themselves as a safety director. They don't picture themselves as owning a trucking company or owning a dealership. They just don't picture themselves in it. So that's what we need to do, is we need to say, all right, let's break through this image. Picture yourself in this industry. And so, I mean, that's one of our biggest challenges, is to overcome this image. And same with drivers. When, if you have some little girl on the side of the, street corner and looks up and an 18-wheeler that goes by, how many parents say, someday you can drive that truck? Yeah,
there's a lot of gender identity involved in bias. I remember in college, I dated a girl, and I said, we were getting out of college, and she was looking for a job, and I was like, you should probably join trucking. She's like, no, that's a male-oriented. See? And I think it's just a gender sort of programming, but there's a lot of technology that's going into it.
That's the part people don't understand.
Yeah.
People look at a tractor trailer and they think diesel engines and smokestacks, right? How do we get them to say, wow, look at the technology in here, all the safety technology, all the technology that not only makes the driver safer, the truck safer, the road safer, but it also connects the connectivity of all the technology in the trucks. And I mean, I don't think as an industry, we do a good enough job selling the technology aspect of the industry.
You think we don't?
I don't think we do.
No, it's very advanced. I mean, we're big believers in the technology revolution, the freight tech revolution that's taking place here, and it's bringing in a different generation. It's bringing in folks that are, if you look at the traditional, growing up in the industry, when I would go to trucking conferences, it was white, male, older. My dad's generation was and so it was an industry that's very hierarchical, paternal, and very white, and that's changing. But it's not only changing in terms of driver orientation, it's also changed in terms of management.
See, that's what I love about it. It used to be Smith & Sons Trucking, right? And now daughters are taking over. I mean, look at Pat Quinn's daughter. I mean, there are businesses where instead of selling it, assuming that the son is going to take over, daughters are taking over for their dads or moms. I mean, typically and I love that. I actually did a whole panel with women who had taken over trucking businesses from their dads.
There's also executives, Shelley Simpson comes to mind as someone who is not family, but has grown to be, and I would actually say this, and I've told Shelley this before, is that if she's not, and a lot of people say, well, she's a powerful woman executive, and I say, screw that. She's a powerful executive, period.
Yeah.
And she may be one of the most powerful in the entire space, and certainly most influential. But it's interesting when you look across the entire landscape of freight, there are not a lot of, Renee Krug comes to mind at Global Trans, but there just isn't enough executive leadership that are women. Why is that?
Well, again, first of all, you have to be in the ranks before you get to go up in the ranks.
It's a business that requires a lot of tribal knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's another thing. So this morning I just spoke at an association event, and I talk about unconscious bias. So if your culture, and look at the trucking industry, you just said white, male, so if the culture, the atmosphere of the company values things like quick decision making, okay, hierarchies, power structures, things like that. That's not the way women work. So like when men make a decision, they narrow the decision, come to a quick conclusion, and for women, they'll look at the options and they'll try to expand the options and then try to decide which is the best one, and they'll collaborate and things like that. Neither one's right or wrong, okay? But if your culture says, we value quick decision making here, then it's uncomfortable for those of us who make decisions differently. And women are more risk averse, where men will take risks, and that's because women activate the amygdala much more quickly than men. So we are more risk averse. So think about that in the boardroom, and let's buy that property. No, let's look at all the options.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, are you familiar with the Grameen Bank, the micro lending in? So in Bangladesh, there's the gentleman who came out with the Grameen Bank is basically micro lending, $20 a year, and he only lends to women. And the reason he said, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for this, but and it's created this. It's helped millions of folks in Bangladesh. But what they do is they lend. It's micro loans, $20. You have to pay it back. But they have found that women are focused on savings. Women are focused, they're risk averse, they're thinking about their families, and they're far more oriented to investing that money and letting it prosper than what men do is they go out and go drinking or whatever. and they're out because it's short-term gratification, which is men were more predisposed to that than what women were. Is what they found.
It's just your way of looking at the world, and neither one's right or wrong. But if all the decision makers in the boardroom are white males, then that's the way your company is going to operate. But when you add more women into the boardroom and in management levels, and they start bringing in a different way of looking at the world and decision making, it actually has been proven to bring in more higher profits, the profitability of the company, the more diversity you have at the top. I mean, it's just a win-win for everyone.
What is the ratio of women executives in the industry?
Actually, FreightWaves did our survey for us, and I thought it was, for executives, I'm thinking it was in the 20%.
Which is higher than the drivers, was one of the things that was interesting in that.
Right. For the carriers, the drivers are right around 10 or 11%, which actually I'm very, very proud of, because 13 years ago we were more like 3%. So the fact that we're bringing more drivers, but I think the one thing that struck me about the FreightWaves survey was how many women are safety directors.
And that makes sense. If you talk about risk aversion or thinking through things, risk, women certainly have that. And are women better rule followers? Is that a better generalization?
Rule followers?
My wife certainly is like a stickler to the rules. So she
I hate to generalize, Craig.
Well,
you know
it's fair. It's probably fair. I'm drawing a lot of conclusions on my wife, but neither here nor there. She keeps trying to get me my registration's out of date in my truck, and she's like, "You must go." And like, I get reminded on a consistent basis. But it makes sense, and I do hate to generalize because I don't think that's fair, and it's probably doing women a disservice. But you are seeing this evolution around technology and around the industry thinking differently about the space. What are you seeing that are, if you look at fleets that have been really successful at attracting women drivers, what are they doing different than the ones that aren't?
Well, some of the best practices are, first of all, using social media. Showing women in your ads, showing women talking about what they love about your company, not using models, using real female drivers.
No clip art.
No clip art.
No, don't go to Shutterstock and download the one or two photos of trucking.
God,
and
so
they have
cute.
to be American trucks, by the way. Like, I always give a hard time to our team if they pull, like if someone creative pulls a European truck.
Yeah.
I'm like, I've never seen that on an American highway. So.
Well, so the best practices are they ask their female drivers, what can we do to attract more female drivers? And sometimes some things are pretty simple. I have actually sat in a room where the female drivers will say to the management, do you think you could get us some women's shirts? And management goes, oh, darn, didn't think about it. So it's really calling attention to how can we make the culture more level. Women don't want women do not want special treatment. Okay, they just want a level
They
playing
want to be
field.
treated equally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So whether that means the maintenance or the equipment, we work with the truck manufacturers on truck cab design and ergonomics, so that women can be as comfortable in a truck, especially if they're a husband-wife team and one's 6'3" and one's 5'2", and they should both be as comfortable and be able to see over the dash and see out the passenger, the windows and climb into the sleeper berth and things like that.
Are the OEMs being responsive?
They are. They are very responsive, and we've actually sent a lot of drivers in and had them sit in trucks and give their feedback. And then the truck stops. Safety is a huge issue. So when people ask me, are there any challenges female drivers face that male drivers don't, I say no, but we prioritize different. And safety goes to the top. We did a best practices survey, and on a scale of 1 to 10, female drivers came back that they felt safe 4.4%, or 4.4 on a scale of 1 to 10. I think that's this industry needs to address this. We need. How would you like it if you came to work every day and said, "Well, I feel safe half the time"?
Yeah, 12% of the time I'm unsafe, which is what you've said. 4.4,
right.
Yeah.
So how do we make it a safer environment? Well, equipment design and also equipment maintenance is huge. And what's your culture like? Where do you send your drivers? What part of town? Is it a bad part of town? Are you sending them into a dark alley, at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a bad part of town? And then what's your culture on in inclement weather?
Right.
Does the driver have the final say and say, you know what, Craig, today I don't feel comfortable because it's raining and snowing and I'm just going to park it.
Yeah.
And if you say, oh, come on, this is trucking.
But that's a universal. I mean, that's true for both women and men. And we covered a story about a driver that had been coached to drive when, in weather that was inclement, and it became a big story. But I'm curious, if you think about how women are influencing that conversation, is it because now the fleets are listening to those comments and the men just didn't think about prioritization of that? Or they just took it for granted that you're a man, you sort of suck it up. What is the reason?
Two things. One is 13 years ago, when I started Women in Trucking companies would tell me, Ellen, we don't care their age, their gender, their race. We don't care.
Which is bullshit, isn't it? Because they did care. I mean, there is. Look, you go back to old school trucking. Back 40 years ago, it was a very white male. Go look at the show Convoy. It's like that's what you saw.
Well, and some of the
right?
recruiting ads too. We'll get you home to your wife and kids. So I would say to them, okay, so you say you don't care about the gender or the race, ethnicity, age, or whatever, but yet you're using men's shirts. You don't have women's restrooms. You're speccing equipment for the 95th percentile male. You're not making it a very female-friendly environment. So the other part of that question is women are becoming more visible and vocal, where I'd say 20 years ago, women just wanted to do their job. Don't call attention to me. I just want to do my job. Just leave me alone. I'll do my job, especially as a driver. Now women are saying, I am woman, hear me roar. And I want you to change equipment, and I want better uniforms or whatever.
It's a generational thing too. It's a generation. Yes. I mean, think about the typical prototypical millennial. There's a sense of entitlement. That's what everyone would sort of describe it as. But there's a sense of I understand my value and I want to be validated for that. And I think that's why you're seeing more vocal. It's also women's. It's interesting if you sort of look at the evolution of women in modern society. As we've gone from women having equal rights to women having a strong voice and having a completely different voice in terms of what's out there. What are you seeing in terms of emerging trends that's forcing fleets to adapt?
So I would say 20 years ago, if I was going to work in a male-dominated environment, I would assume that I would have to adapt, okay? We don't feel that way anymore. People say, I need you to adapt this for me, or I'm calling you out on this because you're not creating a level playing field. So, are you following me?
Yeah.
So, again, if I went into a male-dominated environment, I felt that I needed to adapt. Now I'm going to say, you could make my job easier, or give me a level playing field if you would do this, and this. And then the companies, it's not that the companies don't want to adapt.
They just don't know, maybe?
They don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously.
And they're missing out on a massive pool of drivers that didn't consider trucking as an option.
Well, do you realize how many, until we started asking trucking companies what percentage of their driving fleet was female, do you know how many companies didn't have a clue?
Didn't have what, I'm sorry?
They didn't have a clue. They didn't
Oh, yeah.
track it.
Yeah.
If you were to ask them, they go, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, okay, first of all, if you don't know how many are applying, if you don't know how many are getting the job, and if you don't, hiring and staying, then you really aren't trying to hire diversity.
I once gave a ride to a driver. It was two females, and I started the conversation. How did they get into trucking? And it was interesting. One of the females talked about how she was in an abusive relationship and she was homeless, and she's like, look, the alternative of driving a truck was being homeless, and now I have an opportunity to have income. This is the best. In her mind, this was the best environment she had ever been in, and I thought that was a really interesting story. I mean, it is. There are opportunities and pockets where it makes sense. I'm curious about some of the stories, harassment and women feeling comfortable. What are you seeing in terms of those trends? Are you seeing, is there education? Are fleets understanding the sensitivity training that they need to have? Or is there still a level of concern there?
The ones that get it have a zero tolerance policy, and they do not allow jokes. They don't allow T-shirts that have sayings that are offensive, things like that. But there's a lot of trucking companies out there that just keep turning put their heads in the sand.
Yeah, well, it's a generational thing too.
I believe so. In fact, where I spoke this morning, someone asked me that same question, if it's generational as far as harassment, and I said, the harassers are dying off.
Well, I think now, there's so much education that goes into it in the office. I'm curious, when you get out in the field, how is that?
It's still happening.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's still happening, and that's one of the issues that at Women in Trucking I want to address. I have actually advocated for a same-gender training policy option. So there have been some trucking companies who tried to put in a same-gender training policy, and then because there weren't enough female trainers, it took longer for a female to get trained, and the EEOC came in and sued them, millions of dollars. So I think that if a company wants that option, doesn't mean they have to. Can I give you my Hooters example?
Yeah.
Nobody ever admits to eating at Hooters.
They have good wings. Their shrimp is really good. Their fried shrimp.
So here's my Hooters example. When you go into Hooters, you don't see an 85-year-old woman serving you, okay? Because they're wearing little shorty tops and little orange shorts. You don't see a man serving you. How does Hooters get away with that? They use what they call bona fide occupational exemption. Their customers expect a certain environment, okay, which is young, shapely girls serving them. Doesn't mean that Perkins can only hire young women, right? Perkins can hire anyone they want to serve. But if Hooters wants to have that kind of environment based on hiring only young women because that's what they're known for, let them do it, okay? No one's making you eat there, right? So with a carrier, with the sleeper berth so close, so I'm sitting on an airplane and I'm reading this research done by these two professors in New York, women. And they did this research on the proximity of the bed in a dorm room and how it increases the likelihood of sexual assault and sexual harassment. And so they said there's a sexual tension when two people are sitting on a bed, okay? Especially if you're just getting to know each other. And so I called them up and I said, would this apply to a sleeper berth? And they're like, oh my God, we think so. We would assume so, but they want $100,000 to do the research, so maybe I'll get that done eventually. But if this industry can prove that the proximity of the sleeper berth increases the likelihood of sexual assault and sexual harassment, why couldn't we invoke?
But it would seem like that would make absolute sense. Because it's just, you're in a closed environment. You're in an environment where you're with somebody almost 24 hours a day.
You're sharing sleeping.
And over time, I can imagine that puts, and not even the risk, it's the uncomfortableness of that.
Well, think about this.
Driver.
So if you said, I'm going to go travel with a female colleague, and we're staying in the same hotel room, it's the same
wife
thing.
Would be really, really concerned.
Well, what about this? What if you said, well, I'm going to use the hotel room from 2 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then my coworker gets it from 2. That's what we're making them do in the sleeper berth.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I worked dispatch in my former life, and I worked night dispatch, which was always fun because that's where all the daytime dispatchers and driver managers would leave over all the stuff that was undone. And I remember there was one night where we had it was a female driver driving around with a male trainer, and the husband was irate. The husband was not in the truck, but he was irate. And he called in, he was basically trying to harass her into telling where she was at. So in those days, there was no email.
Right.
And there was no text messages. So you had to send SATCOM messages. And
Oh.
we would basically, as a service, for free, we would send notes. You were basically a transcribe. You probably remember this at
Yes.
Schneider. You would transcribe for the family could communicate with the driver and vice versa, and you would become effectively an operator. And I remember doing that one night, and there was a husband who was completely unhinged because he was convinced that his wife, who was in the cab of the truck, and he started to make violent physical threats towards her and me at this point.
Wow.
Which I was okay. There was a room full of folks that worked in the industry, so we were fine inside the building. But it was interesting because I imagine that's a concern. He had gone and gotten very concerned about that.
Many years ago, I did my thesis on the complex identities of women married to professional drivers. And I remember interviewing this one woman, and her husband was a trainer. And this is many years ago. Whenever he would get a female trainee, he would call her and have her have lunch. The three of them would have lunch. And she could either approve or disapprove. And the company was okay with that. If she approved, then he was allowed to take the female out as a trainee. But if she goes, no, I don't like that one, assign her to someone else, the company was okay with that.
Yeah.
But that way she had some control over.
She had some power. It's interesting, when I was dating, I got on the apps. And interesting because Bumble is an app that had taken the Tinder model and had reversed it towards women get to be the first to communicate.
Oh, wow.
And so women were in control. And in terms of there's a lot of satisfaction ratings, is that Bumble had a much higher satisfaction because women felt empowered.
Oh.
And women that had, it tended to attract women that wanted to, that were more ambitious, and there was all this sort of data to support it, that given women the ability to be the first one to outreach, even though the communication ultimately after that first outreach was the same, it made them feel empowered. And it was interesting because they became the selector versus
that
the
is
selectee.
interesting. I didn't know we were going to talk about dating apps.
I mean, I spent way too much time on these apps when I was single. I have too much learned history from it, and I still draw a lot of my own personal conclusions. But it's interesting because there is some psychology to that. There's a lot of psychology goes into it. I'm wondering, what is it fleets can do? I mean, we talk about this issue around safety. I think at times the industry wants to duck when there's any conversations that's not comfortable because it can be used in a bad context or make the industry look bad, but these are reality.
It's a reality, and I think that this industry needs to stop putting its head in the sand and trying to be gender blind because we're the only industry that mixes genders. I mean, even airlines, they have separate sleeping quarters, and and so I've gone to the truck manufacturers like, can you somehow separate? So here's the solution: best practices, day cabs, hotel rooms.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But that's a big ask for.
Oh, it
fleets.
is. It is. But there are companies that are doing that.
Who are some examples?
Carbon Express.
Okay.
They only have day cabs, and they'll.
Now, do they ride teams? Are these teams? So it's all solo.
Solo. I don't think they have teams, but I've talked to.
What's the advantage of having? What's the advantage of having day cabs? Is it trainer student?
No, they're out solo.
Okay.
But the reason there's
women aren't at the truck stop where they feel less safe.
So not all their drivers, but I've talked to female drivers from Carbon, and okay, first of all, they get a real bed. Okay, they get a shower.
Yeah.
They get their own bathroom.
Yeah.
They get to work out in the morning, often a free breakfast. They get to keep their points, and they're refreshed. And then they get in the cab of the truck and drive for 11 hours.
Now, how do you do with the $80 a night? It seems like that gets expensive.
I would think so. But
I guess the fleet decides.
You asked me for best practices. You didn't ask me
No,
for.
I love this. No, but I think it's a conversation that's immediately going to pop in a CFO's head.
Sure.
Well, that's great, but it costs $80 a night per person.
Or, use the corporate lodging card and they're $30 a night at the Red Roof or whatever. But sure, it's an expense. Okay, but what does a meal and a shower cost?
And then what's the turnover? And you start to look at that, and you get parking, and that seems like a great solution. What's another one that is less? I mean, that changes the business model of a lot of fleets.
Right. So if I tell you that I think in training environments we should have inward-facing cameras, I get a lot of kickback from people. But almost anywhere you work. I don't even know if you have cameras in here, but if any bank, and you walk down the street, if you work at Walmart, you have cameras on you 24/7, right? So I think in a training situation, having an inward-facing camera would hold both the driver, the trainer, and the trainee accountable. Would protect.
For sure.
Both of them.
For sure.
Only for training and not in the sleeper berth.
Yeah.
So only in the cab. I think that's a solution, because you better be on your best behavior, because you know what? If you say, something, I've got it on camera.
And it avoids potential liability. And that's
Exactly.
what, we had Cassandra Gaines, who's an attorney that tracks this industry, and she was actually talking about the inward-facing camera. And we were talking about dogs in the cab of the truck. And there's a lot of arguments that dogs are great because you feel comfortable. Everyone likes having a companion. But then there's also the downside that dogs are an unknown risk. And she said if you had a dog, then you definitely want an inward-facing camera, because if in the event of an accident, you can disprove that the dog, because the assumption is if the dog was in the cab, they're the
It
ones
was a
that caused the
distraction.
accident. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is drivers are protected, because an attorney can't say, well, you were probably texting or using your phone, or you were distracted. If you have an inward-facing camera, it's protected drivers a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm advocating it in a training situation so that the trainer and the trainee are being recorded.
It's for safety purposes.
It's for safety
How
purposes.
do we get beyond this image problem that we have as an industry, that it's a male, it's a man and a male-oriented industry? Is it just? I mean, the media certainly have certainly propagated the
Right.
movies have propagated it.
Well, I'll
And
tell you
at
what we're
times-
doing.
At times, our industry propagates it. It's a very tough macho industry. How do we?
So
how do we
I'll tell you what
change
we're
that?
doing at Women in Trucking. We came out with a truck driver doll. Okay, Claire, the truck driver doll. You can get it from Women in Trucking. We want little girls and boys to be able to play with the truck driver doll. We created the Girl Scout transportation patch. We found out the Boy Scouts had a transportation patch and Girl Scouts didn't. And so far, over 1,500 girls have earned that patch. And we have an activity book that goes along with it called Scouting for Cookies. And it talks about how the grain goes from the field to the bakery in a truck, bakery to packaging in a truck, packaging. I want kids to say, Mom, Dad, see that truck? Those could be my cookies. That could be my milk. Or that could be the doll that we just ordered. I want them to have a personal relationship to the trucking industry, which I don't think people do. And you probably hear this all the time. People say to me, well, I see the trucks on the road, but I really don't think about them.
Oh, all the time. Or you get the universal. I bet when you were at Schneider, it says, when people would meet me and they knew the U.S. Express connection, they would say, oh, I've never seen your trucks. And then the next day they would call me and be like, hey, I saw one of your trucks. No, you've seen them every day. You just didn't notice.
I bet at Schneider it's the same thing.
I remember sitting.
Unless you said, we're the orange trucks.
The orange trucks.
So everybody knows what those are.
I'd sit in a cab and they'd say, well, so who do you work for? Them, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But people, and I'll tell you a quick story. When my kids were little, we went to a parade and there was a Schneider truck in the parade. And so every time they'd see a Schneider truck, they'd say, there's that truck that was in the parade. I'd say, there's 14,000 of them.
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
And so then, they finally realized.
I would have people say, hey, I saw your dad. And I'm like, no, you didn't. It was one of the trucks. But there was a lot of that happens. It's an industry, but I find it's not just a female-male issue. It's an issue overall about an industry that a lot of people think are dying or is an uninteresting industry. And I always ask executives, if what would it take for you to promote even your own kids to be a driver or these different jobs? And I think you start to put it in terms of what you would want or what you would expect. I think they think differently. Like if you have a daughter, what would get you comfortable? And I think they would think differently about those.
I would hope so. And I think that's what we're doing at Women in Trucking, is getting people to think differently and maybe pointing out things and saying, have you thought about this and have you thought about that? And I think that's why we're at 5,500 members in 10 countries, and where were we 13 years ago? Zero.
Yeah.
So, I mean, our conference, we only had our 5th conference and 1,100 people. I mean, I think we've struck a nerve in this industry, and I want to be the disruptor. I want us to come out and say, this is how we can make a more female-friendly work environment for everyone, and I think the industry is willing to listen.
When we first started FreightWaves, and it was not by design. We had 2 females. One was our marketing, president of marketing, and the other was my wife. Now my wife, she wasn't my wife at the time. And it was interesting because we hired a young female. and there was probably 12 males and 3 females, and she was very uncomfortable only because there was this sort of, and it was not by design, it was because when we wanted people who had a lot of experience, particularly in management, and unfortunately it tends to be it's a male-oriented business, and when you're a startup, you tend to attract risk, people that are willing to take risks, and so it's a different world. But it's certainly a big issue, and there's a big opportunity, particularly when we're talking labor shortage issues and opportunities.
I think that's one of the reasons women in trucking has been so successful, is because companies look at us and say, we can fill trucks if we start attracting women. And I'm sorry that that's why people are, supporting women in trucking, because I'd like them to support it just because they believe we should have more women in the industry as a whole. But they're looking at trucks and saying, wow, 50% of the population, and I only have 5%.
It all comes back to the money at the end of the day, right?
It is.
Whether it's fortune or reality, the reality is that there is a lot of women opportunity, not only in driving jobs, but also in management jobs. And you talked about cultural changes of risk aversion, more methodical, more emotional EQ that you get out of women than you would get out of men in those
collaboration,
roles.
teamwork.
So Ellen, how do people join the Women in Trucking, and why should they join?
They should join because they support our mission. and my response is, well, if you think 10% of the driver population is being women is enough, and if you think 20% of management is enough, then don't join. But if you believe in our mission to bring more women in, then join. And it's pretty simple, womenintrucking.org. And we've got lots of ways that people can be more engaged. We've got a magazine and newsletter. We also have a scholarship foundation, and we gave out like $38,000 in scholarships last year. So we're walking the walk. We're not just talking the talk and saying we're going to make this a better industry, and we're going to bring more women in, and we're going to change the industry in the process.
Can men join as well?
Oh yeah, 18% of our members are men.
Got it.
Anyone who believes in the mission can join.
Fantastic. Well, Ellen, thanks for coming on to Full Speed Ahead. I'm Craig Fuller. Be sure to check us out on social media. FreightWaves TV is also available on the Apple Store. You can watch it on Apple TV, on Roku, Google Play as well. Tune into the live stream every single day from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. right here on FreightWaves.com. And if you haven't got your tickets to FreightWaves Live, that is in Atlanta on May 5th and 6th. It is the Freight Tech event of the year. We bring in top decision makers from around the industry, C-level executives that are looking to make decisions, and venture capitalists that are looking to deploy capital. So be sure to check out FreightWaves Live in Atlanta coming up just in a few months.